On certain evenings, when the day had done what it needed to do and was ready to set its tools down, the road would look like an invitation rather than a route. The light would soften in a way that made ordinary things seem kinder. Telephone poles would stand in a long, patient line, and the wires between them would hold a faint glow where the last of the sun touched. Fields would give off a calm, late warmth, as if they were still remembering the heat of the afternoon, and the air would carry that familiar mix of dust, grass, and something faintly sweet from clover or wildflowers along the shoulder. On one such evening, a man named Tom eased an older sedan out from a gravel driveway and onto the county road without hurry. The car had a wide bench seat and a simple dash, the kind with a few steady gauges and a radio that warmed up with a soft hum. The engine sounded content, not loud, just sure of itself. The tyres clicked gently over the loose stones at the edge of the drive, then settled into the smoother part of the road where the asphalt had been patched now and then, and the seams made a quiet rhythm. Tom did not have a strict destination, not in the way people talked about destinations in the daytime. He had an idea, and that was enough. He had a half-tank of gas, a small thermos of coffee set low beside him, and the easy feeling that came from having finished supper and the small chores that followed. The kitchen had been wiped down, the porch light had been checked, and the screen door had been latched. A neighbour's dog had barked once, and then the sound had drifted away. The evening was clear. The sky was moving into that deepening blue that arrived just after the bright part was done. The road ahead ran straight for a time, then bent slightly as it followed the land. There were no hills steep enough to call hills, just long rises and gentle dips. In the west, the sun was already low, and the colour near the horizon had taken on a pale gold that turned slowly to peach, then faded into a quieter shade. The fields on either side looked wide and restful, and now and then a grove of trees gathered around a farmhouse, holding it like a hand around a small light. Tom drove with the window part way down. The air that came in was mild and carried the sounds of evening. A cicada started up, and then another. From a distance there was the faint chuff of a tractor finishing up somewhere, and after a moment that sound stopped as if someone had turned a knob. Birds moved in the hedgerows, settling themselves. A few swallows stitched the sky with quick turns before they disappeared toward their roosts. The first town on this road was little more than a cluster of buildings at a four-way stop, but it had a name on a white board with black letters, and that made it a town. A grain elevator stood near the tracks, tall and pale against the darkening sky. There was a small hardware store with a narrow front and two windows that displayed rakes, brooms, and a line of stacked feed bags. Across from it stood a gas station with two pumps and a small bell that could be rung if a person wanted service. The station's sign was lit, not bright, just steady. Tom slowed as he rolled through, letting the car coast past the storefronts. On the corner was a barber shop, its pole still turning even though the chair inside looked empty. The glass held reflections of the street and the growing evening. Beside it was a small office with a painted sign that read insurance, and next to that a place that used to be a dress shop and now held a few second-hand tables and a row of lamps in the window. The lamps were on, giving the interior a cosy glow. A woman inside adjusted one of them, then stepped back and looked as if she was satisfied with the arrangement. At the far end of the block was a cafe, not large, with a sign that promised pie. Through the window, Tom could see the shine of the counter and the pale circle of a ceiling fan turning. A few people sat in booths, their faces easy, their shoulders relaxed. One man leaned over a newspaper that lay open like a map. Another lifted a cup slowly and set it down again. It was the kind of place where the day came to rest, not all at once, but in small, calm pieces. Tom let the town pass by at the speed of someone reading a familiar page. He did not stop here, not tonight, though he might another evening. The road took him past a small park with a flagpole and a bench. The flag hung quiet, then moved once as a late breeze slid through. A pair of boys on bicycles coasted along the sidewalk, their wheels whispering. They turned toward home without racing, the way boys did when the streetlights were expected to come on soon. Outside town, the road opened again. The sky deepened and the first evening star appeared, small but firm. Tom's headlights were not necessary yet, but he switched them on anyway, a steady habit. The beams lay pale on the pavement. The dash lights glowed green and calm. The radio murmured with a faint static, then settled into a station carrying soft music and an announcer's voice that sounded as if it had always been there. The car moved on through country that was settling down for the night. In a pasture, a few cows stood near a trough, their shapes dark against the grass. A windmill turned slowly. A barn sat with its doors closed, and a pale square of light showed from a loft window, as if someone had gone up to check something and had left a lamp on. The smell of cut hay drifted in as Tom passed a field where the bales lay in rows like quiet punctuation. The next town was bigger, though still small enough that a person could know most faces by sight. It had a main street that ran straight for 3 blocks and then met the river. The river was not wide, but it moved steadily, and there was a bridge with iron rails that caught the last light in thin, bright lines. As Tom approached, he saw the town's water tower rising above the trees, painted a pale colour with the town name in block letters. A little farther in, the streetlights were coming on one by one, each one flickering and then holding steady. The sidewalks were clean. The storefront windows were lit, and behind the glass were modest displays. Work shirts on hangers, a row of canned goods stacked into a neat pyramid, a few pairs of shoes set on a stand. Tom drove slowly down the main street. There was a movie theatre with a marquee, the letters arranged to advertise a double feature. The theatre doors were still open, and someone inside swept with a wide broom, making steady strokes. The smell of popcorn drifted out, light and buttery, mixing with the evening air. A couple stood near the ticket window, speaking quietly. Their posture suggested no urgency, just the simple matter of deciding what time to go in. On the next corner stood a small department store, with a tall clock mounted above its entrance. The hands of the clock were visible from the street, and it kept time with a kind of public reassurance. Tom had bought socks there once, and a winter coat a few years ago, and he could remember the creak of the wooden floor and the faint scent of fabric and soap. Tonight the store was still open, and a clerk inside moved between counters, straightening a stack of folded shirts. Near the centre of town was a courthouse square, the courthouse itself built of brick with white columns and wide steps. The lawn around it was trimmed. A few older men sat on benches, hats tipped back, speaking in low voices. A woman walked her dog along the edge of the grass. The dog moved carefully, pausing to sniff, then continuing, as if the walk was not a task but a way to set the day down gently. Tom turned off the main street and drove through the neighbourhood streets where the houses sat close together. The porches were lively with small lamps. Rocking chairs moved slowly. Somewhere a radio played softly, a different station, carrying a baseball game with the announcer's steady, unhurried voice. In one yard a sprinkler turned in a slow circle, clicking and hissing, and the water caught the last of the light in brief silver flashes. At a corner house, a man stood at the curb watering a line of flowers in a narrow bed. He lifted the hose slightly as Tom passed, not waving, just shifting to let the water fall where it needed to. A child's laughter came from farther back, then faded. A screen door closed with a familiar spring sound. The whole neighbourhood felt like a set of small routines being finished. Tom did not linger long. He turned back toward the main street, crossed it, and headed out on the road that followed the river for a while. The river was now a dark ribbon. The trees along its banks made a soft wall of shadow. The air near the water was cooler, and it came in through the window like a quiet relief. He passed a small bait shop near the edge of town. Its sign was lit by a single bulb, and the door stood open. Inside, a man sat on a stool behind the counter, reading a magazine. The shop smelled of minnows and wood and old paper. Outside, a couple of wooden rowboats were stacked in a neat line, their paint worn smooth by time and use. The shop was the kind of place that belonged to the river and to evenings like this. A mile or two farther, Tom saw a picnic area set back from the road. There were a few tables under trees and a low stone grill. No one was there now. The grass was newly cut, and the scent of it floated on the air. A small sign posted the rules in simple letters. Tom kept driving, letting the empty tables and quiet trees slide past in the corner of his vision like a peaceful thought. The road bent away from the river and headed into a patchwork of farms and woods. The last of the bright light had left the sky, and the colours were now deep and calm. The horizon held a faint glow, but overhead the blue was darkening. A few more stars appeared, not all at once, but steadily, as if someone were turning them on gently. Tom passed a roadside stand that sold produce in the daytime. Now it was closed, the shutters down, but a chalkboard still leaned by the steps with faint writing that promised tomatoes and sweet corn. The stand smelled faintly of earth and vegetables even now. A stray cat sat beneath the steps, watching the road, its eyes catching a flash of Tom's headlights as he passed. The next town was smaller again, quieter. It had a single main street, and the buildings were older, their brick dark with age. A sign at the edge of town announced a speed limit, and Tom obeyed it without thinking. The town seemed to appreciate slow movement. A single streetlight hung over the first intersection, its light making a pale circle on the pavement. There was a post office, its flag lowered for the night, and a small bank with a stone front. Beside the bank was a shop that sold radios and small appliances. In the window were a few table lamps and a fan, and a display of batteries in neat rows. The shop was closed, but the window light was still on, as if the owner liked to leave things looking welcoming. Farther down was a diner with a long window and stools lined up inside. The stools were empty now, but a waitress in a white apron wiped down the counter with slow, practiced motions. A man in the back swept the floor. The work was quiet and unhurried. A pot of coffee might still have been on, and a slice of pie might still have been available if someone came in late. The diner's sign glowed softly, and the window reflected the streetlight and the dark shapes of trees across the road. Tom drove past a small storefront that had once been a pharmacy. The painted letters were still visible on the glass, though the shop now held something else, perhaps a small office or storage. He could picture in his mind the old soda fountain that used to be there. The stools lined up, the clink of a spoon against a glass. He did not dwell on it in a way that stirred anything sharp. It was simply part of the town's shape, part of what it had carried from one year to the next. At the far end of town, the road crossed railroad tracks. The tracks were quiet now, but the crossing lights stood ready, their red lenses dark. Beyond the tracks, the town faded into open land again. Tom's tires made a soft hum on the pavement. The radio continued its low, steady sound. The night air grew cooler, and Tom reached over and turned the collar of his jacket up slightly without taking his eyes from the road. He drove through a stretch where the houses were scattered. Some had porch lights on, some did not. A few had curtains drawn, and behind those curtains the interior lights gave a warm yellow glow. A dog barked once at the sound of the car, then stopped, as if deciding it was not worth the effort. Crickets had taken over now, their steady song filling the spaces between other sounds. There was comfort in the way the night settled. It did not arrive with fanfare. It simply moved in, little by little, like a quilt being pulled up. The farms, the towns, the trees, all of it found its place under the dark sky. Tom came to a gentle rise, and from the top he could see, in the distance, another town's lights gathered low on the horizon. The lights were modest, not bright like a city, just a cluster. A water tower stood there too, its top marked by a small blinking light. The road descended and carried him toward that quiet glow. As he neared, he passed a small drive-in with a screen visible beyond the fence. The lot was mostly empty at this hour, but a few cars were parked in rows, their silhouettes lined up facing the screen. The picture was faint from the road, but the light from it flickered across the parked cars. The sound did not carry far. It was as if the movie belonged to those inside the fence and did not need to announce itself to the rest of the night. Tom drove on, and the road brought him into the town's edge where the first buildings were a feed store and a small lumber yard. The lumber was stacked in neat piles. The yard office light was on, and someone inside moved behind the window, perhaps finishing paperwork. The smell of fresh wood drifted in, clean and dry. There was something satisfying about lumber yards, about things stacked straight and ready for tomorrow. He came into the town's main street, which was wider than the others, and there were angled parking spaces along the curb. A few cars were parked there, and their chrome caught the streetlights. The stores were closing now, and a couple of shopkeepers stood in doorways, talking to one another. Their voices were too low to make out, but the posture was familiar. Hands in pockets, shoulders slightly forward, conversation that would end when each turned toward home. On one corner, a small bakery's light still shone. A sign in the window said fresh bread, and behind the glass were loaves lined up on shelves. The baker, an older man with rolled-up sleeves, moved slowly behind the counter. He set something down, then wiped his hands on a cloth. There was a calm satisfaction in the scene, the kind that came from making something daily and making it well. Tom parked for a moment along the curb, not because he needed to, but because the town felt like it invited a pause. He left the engine running. The radio stayed low. He watched the street as if it were a living thing settling into sleep. Across the street, a couple walked with small paper sacks in their hands, perhaps from the bakery. They moved at an easy pace. They spoke now and then, but mostly they walked in the shared quiet. A man stepped out of the barber shop and turned the sign from open to closed. He pulled down the shade and turned off the lights. The pole outside continued to turn for a moment, then stopped. Farther down, the door of a small bookstore opened and a woman stepped out carrying a stack of books tied with string. She put them carefully into the trunk of her car. She closed the trunk with a soft click and stood for a moment, looking up at the sky as if checking the weather for tomorrow. Then she got in and drove away slowly, her taillights glowing red and calm. Tom sat there a while longer, taking in the town's steady rhythm. He remembered evenings like this from years back, when he had been younger and the towns had seemed larger. The stores had been busier, the sidewalks had been fuller. But the basic shape was the same. Dusk came, lights came on. People finished their work and went home. The road waited. He eased the car back into motion and turned down a side street that led toward the residential part of town. The houses here were modest, with small yards and short walkways. Many had porches with swings. In one yard, a man sat on the porch steps peeling an apple with a small knife, his hands working in slow circles. The peel fell in a single curling strip. He looked up as Tom passed, not startled, just aware, and then returned his attention to the apple. At the end of the street, Tom passed the town's small school. The building was brick, with tall windows and a flagpole out front. The playground beyond was empty now. The swings hung still. The slide caught a faint sheen from the streetlight. The school felt quiet and waiting, ready for tomorrow's voices and footsteps. Nearby was a church with white siding and a tall steeple. Its windows were dark, but a light burned near the side door. The light made a small patch of brightness on the steps. The churchyard was trimmed, and a few old trees stood around it like guardians. The bell did not ring. It did not need to. The church simply stood, part of the town's steady presence. Tom turned back toward the main road, and as he did, he passed the town's little library, a modest building with a sign out front. The library's lights were off, but a few books were visible through the window, arranged on a display table. The sight was small and pleasing, like a promise that there were stories waiting for anyone who wanted them. Out of town again, the road grew darker. The headlights made a long tunnel of light on the pavement. The fields were now mostly shadow. The sky overhead was dark enough that the stars stood out clearly. The air coming in through the window was cool and carried the scent of damp earth in places where the ground held water. Tom drove through a stretch of road lined with trees that formed an arch overhead. The branches met above, and the leaves made a soft ceiling. The headlights threw moving patterns on the trunks. The car moved through it like a slow boat through a quiet channel. When he emerged from the trees, the open land returned, and the horizon was a low, dark line. He came upon a small bridge over a creek. The creek was shallow, but the sound of water moving over stones could be heard faintly through the open window. The bridge rails were wooden, and they flashed past in the headlights. On the far side, a small sign marked the creek's name, painted in simple letters. Tom read it as he passed, then let it go. The road took him toward another town, and this one had a different feel. It sat on slightly higher ground, and as Tom approached, he could see the lights scattered along the slope. The town's main street was narrower. The buildings were closer together. There was an old hotel on the corner, its sign lit, its windows dark except for a few on the lower floor. Tom drove into town and found himself in front of a general store that looked as if it had been there for a long time. The window held a display of canned peaches, flour, and a few jars of penny candy. A row of work gloves hung near the door. The store was closed now, but a light in the back still glowed, and the silhouettes of shelves were visible. The place had the quiet dignity of a building that had served many ordinary days. Down the street, a small tavern's door opened, and a couple of men stepped out. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, talking in low voices. One of them laughed softly, not loud, just a brief sound. Then they shook hands and each turned in a different direction. The door closed, and the light inside became just a rectangle on the sidewalk. Tom continued, passing a row of houses that faced the street. Many had curtains drawn, some had porch lights on. A few had the soft blue glow of a television inside, flickering behind the curtains. The flicker was gentle and distant. It did not shout into the night. It was simply part of the evening, like crickets and streetlights. At the edge of town, Tom saw a small sign for a scenic overlook, just a short road leading up to a rise. He turned onto it without thinking too hard. The gravel crunched under the tires. The car climbed slowly. At the top there was a small pull-off and a wooden rail. Beyond it the land spread out, and in the distance the lights of the towns he had passed were faint, scattered, like small embers. Tom turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was noticeable, but it was not empty. The night had its own sounds, crickets, steady and patient, a breeze in the grass, somewhere far off the low call of a night bird. Tom sat in the still car and looked out. The dash lights faded. The radio went silent. The sky above was full of stars, and the larger ones seemed to hold their place with quiet confidence. He took the thermos and poured a small amount of coffee into the cap. The coffee was warm and plain. He sipped it slowly. There was nothing else he needed. The evening had space in it, and he was simply resting in that space. After a while, he started the engine again. The car returned to life with a familiar sound. He turned the headlights back on and eased down the gravel road to the main road again. The tires hummed as they found the pavement. The radio came back with its soft static and then a clear voice. The announcer spoke a few calm words about the time and the weather, and then a song began, a steady tune that sat gently in the air. Tom drove on. The road now led through a long stretch of farmland where the fields were divided by low fences and narrow lanes. Now and then a farmhouse light glowed in the distance. A barn owl crossed the road ahead, pale and silent, and then disappeared into the dark. Tom did not brake hard. The owl was already gone, and the night returned to its steady pace. He passed a small cluster of mailboxes at the end of a lane. They were lined up like a little neighborhood of their own, each one with a name painted or a number. Some were new and shiny, some were older and dented, but they all stood there patiently, waiting for morning. A streetlight was not near them, so the headlights briefly made them bright, and then they vanished behind. Another town appeared ahead, and this one was set around a bend, so it arrived quietly. The first sign was aglow in the trees. Then came a small bridge and the first streetlight. The town's main street was short, and at its centre was a small town hall with a bell tower. The bell did not ring. It simply stood, a shape against the night. Tom drove through at a steady, slow pace. A few storefronts were dark, their windows reflecting the streetlight. A laundromat sign glowed blue, and inside, a few machines turned slowly, their round doors reflecting the light. A man sat on a bench, reading a folded paper, waiting without impatience. There was a small diner here too, and this one was still open. A light shone behind the counter. Two people sat at the stools, their shoulders relaxed. The cook moved behind the counter, not hurried, turning something on the grill. The smell of coffee drifted out when the door opened briefly and then closed again. Tom did not stop, though he thought about it. He could imagine sitting in a booth with a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, listening to the quiet murmur of voices, the soft clink of dishes. But he kept driving. The road was part of the evening's comfort, and he wanted to stay in motion a little longer, to let the towns pass by like calm stations on a late-night broadcast. Beyond the town, the road narrowed again. The centre line faded in places where the paint had worn. The shoulders were soft, and the grass grew close. The headlights caught the reflective eyes of a rabbit near the edge of the ditch. The rabbit remained still for a moment, then hopped away into the grass. The night continued, unbothered. Tom drove through a stretch where the land was flatter and the sky felt bigger. The stars looked as if they were closer. The air was cooler now, and he rolled the window up slightly. The car's interior was quiet, the sound of the engine steady and low. The seat beneath him was worn but comfortable, shaped by years of use. As he drove, he thought about the towns, not in a way that pulled at him, but in a way that simply noticed. Each town had its own small rhythm. One had a bakery still lit late. Another had a courthouse square where people sat and talked. Another had a general store with penny candy in the window. None of them were trying to be anything other than what they were. They were places where people lived, worked, ate supper, turned off lights, and went to bed. The roads between them were the quiet threads that held them in a shared fabric. He passed a field where fireflies flickered near the ground. Their lights came and went, small and soft, like signals that meant nothing urgent. They simply existed in their own gentle timing. The sight made the field look alive in a quiet way. Tom watched them for a moment as the car moved past, then the fireflies disappeared behind. Soon the road brought him near his own town again, the familiar curve and the familiar line of trees that marked the approach. He could see, in the distance, the glow of a few street lights and the steady light atop the water tower. The town's shape was known to him, not exciting but comforting. It was the kind of place where a person could drive through the streets at night and recognize the houses by their porches, their fences, the way their lights looked behind curtains. Tom entered town on a quiet street. The main street was mostly dark now. A few signs still glowed, the drugstore's small sign, the cafe's window light, the gas station's sign at the corner. The movie theatre had finished its last show, and the marquee lights were off. The sidewalk looked empty. The streetlight made long shadows. He drove past the cafe, and he could see that the chairs had been turned up on the tables. The counter was clean. A lone worker wiped the last spot on the floor near the door. The worker turned off a light, then another. The cafe's sign remained lit, a quiet promise for morning. Tom turned down the street that led to his home. The houses were quiet, their windows dark or softly lit. Porch lights glowed. A few moths fluttered near them, drawn to the warmth. The trees along the street made a canopy overhead, and the leaves moved faintly in the breeze. He passed the small park with the flagpole. The flag was not visible now in the dark. The bench sat empty. The grass was a darker shade. The park looked peaceful, as if it was holding the day's sounds inside it, saving them for tomorrow. Tom turned into his driveway and let the car roll to a stop on the gravel. The stones crunched softly. He sat for a moment with the engine still running, listening to the steady idle. The radio played softly, and the announcer's voice returned, saying a few calm words before another song began. Tom listened without leaning forward, without trying to catch every word. It was enough that the sound was there. He turned the engine off. The night closed in gently. The porch light cast a small pool of brightness near the steps. The rest of the yard was shadow and soft shapes. Tom stepped out and closed the car door with a quiet click. He stood for a moment, letting the air settle around him. The crickets were steady. A distant dog barked once, then stopped. Somewhere a screen door closed. He walked up the steps and opened the front door. The house was quiet and familiar, with the faint scent of supper still lingering. He set the thermos on the kitchen counter. He hung his jacket on the back of a chair. He moved through the rooms, not turning on many lights, just a lamp here and there. Each light made a small island in the dark, the way the street lights had done in the towns he had passed. Outside, the road lay still, waiting for morning traffic, waiting for the next evening when someone might take a slow drive through towns at dusk, past lit windows and quiet storefronts, past courthouse lawns and diners closing up, past fields where fireflies flickered and creeks moved over stones. The towns would be there, holding their steady routines, turning on their lights one by one as the day ended, and the road would connect them as it always had, in the calm, patient way of things that do not need to hurry. The highway had a way of settling into itself as evening came on. the long stretch of pavement taking on a softer look once the heat of the day had begun to lift. The sky was still light, though the sun had already dropped behind a line of low hills to the west. The colour near the horizon was a pale orange that slowly faded into a calm blue above. The air coming through the open window carried the smell of warm asphalt, cut grass, and a hint of oil from the passing trucks. It was the kind of evening that had been common in the 1970s, when a drive along the highway was not a race to get somewhere, but a way of being somewhere for a while. An older station wagon moved steadily in the right lane, its engine making a low, even sound. The dashboard lights glowed a gentle green, and the radio was set to an AM station that played soft country songs and easy listening tunes. The announcer spoke in a voice that sounded as though it had always belonged to the night. There was no hurry in his words, and the music that followed each short introduction seemed to settle into the car the way dust settled on a bookshelf. The driver, a man named Paul, kept one hand resting lightly on the wheel. The other lay on the edge of the seat near a folded road map that had been opened and closed many times. He had taken this highway often over the years. It ran past small towns, service stations, roadside diners, and stretches of open land where the sky seemed to widen. He did not have a strict schedule. The idea was simply to follow the familiar road for a while, to let the miles pass at their own pace and to notice the way the evening arranged itself along the way. The first town appeared in the distance as a cluster of low buildings and a few streetlights that had just come on. A large sign on the right side of the road announced the town's name in tall block letters. Below it, a smaller sign welcomed travellers and asked them to drive carefully. Paul eased off the accelerator a little as he approached, not because he needed to, but because slowing down felt like part of the ritual of passing through a place like this. The highway widened into a main street lined with modest storefronts. A gas station stood on the corner, its canopy lights glowing white against the darkening sky. Two pumps stood beneath it, their hoses coiled neatly. A man in a cap wiped down the windshield of a parked sedan, while another man leaned against the side of the building, talking quietly. The smell of gasoline and motor oil drifted across the road, mixing with the cooler air of evening. Across the street was a diner with a long window and a row of stools inside. The lights were on, and the counter shone with a clean, steady brightness. A waitress moved behind the counter carrying a pot of coffee. A few people sat in booths, their shoulders relaxed, their conversations low. A neon sign in the window blinked slowly, spelling out the word Eats. It did not flash or change colour, it simply glowed and held its place. Paul drove past a hardware store with a narrow front and a wide display window. Inside, rakes, brooms, and garden tools were arranged in tidy rows. A sign near the door advertised paint and nails. The store looked as though it might close soon for the night, but for now it remained open, welcoming anyone who might still need a length of rope or a box of screws before morning. Farther down the street, a small movie theatre stood with a marquee that advertised a double feature. The letters were arranged neatly, and a few lights along the edge of the sign cast a soft glow. The doors were open, and a man inside swept the lobby floor with slow, steady strokes. The smell of popcorn drifted out, light and familiar. A couple stood near the ticket window, looking up at the sign and then back at each other, deciding without urgency whether to go in. At the end of the main street, the highway narrowed again and continued on through open country. The town slipped behind, its lights becoming smaller and softer in the rearview mirror. The road stretched ahead, a long ribbon of pavement that curved gently with the land. Telephone poles stood at regular intervals, their wires cutting thin lines across the sky. Paul rolled the window down a little farther. The air was cooler now, and it carried the sound of crickets starting up in the fields. A tractor worked somewhere in the distance, its low rumble fading as it moved away. The radio played a song that had been popular a few years earlier, and Paul recognized it without feeling any need to hum along. It was enough to let it play, to let it be part of the evening. A roadside billboard came into view, advertising a motel several miles ahead. The sign showed a simple drawing of a building with a row of doors and a parking lot in front. Beneath it, bold letters promised clean rooms and colour television. Paul smiled faintly at the sign, not because it was amusing, but because it was so much like the others he had seen over the years. The promise of a place to rest, plainly stated, without embellishment. The highway dipped slightly and crossed a narrow bridge over a creek. The water below reflected the fading light, and the sound of it moving over stones could be heard faintly through the open window. On the far side of the bridge, a small sign named the creek in simple letters. Paul read it as he passed, then let it go, just another small detail in the steady flow of the drive. The next town was a little larger. Its lights were visible from farther away, and the highway fed into a broad avenue lined with tall trees. Streetlights stood at regular intervals, each one casting a pale circle on the pavement. The town's water tower rose above the rooftops, its name painted in large letters that could be read from the road. Paul drove slowly along the avenue. On one side, a row of modest houses faced the street. Many had porch lights on, and a few had rocking chairs that moved gently in the evening breeze. On the other side were shops and small offices. A barber shop with a striped pole stood near the corner, its door closed but its light still on. The pole turned slowly, the red and white stripes blending into a soft blur. There was a department store with a tall clock mounted above its entrance. The hands of the clock were visible from the street, keeping time for anyone who cared to look. Inside, a clerk straightened a stack of folded shirts while another person adjusted a display of shoes. The store looked calm and orderly, as though it had spent the day doing exactly what it was meant to do. Near the centre of town, a courthouse square opened up, with a brick building at its heart. The courthouse had white columns and wide steps. A few people sat on benches around the lawn, talking quietly. A woman walked her dog along the edge of the grass. The dog paused now and then to sniff, then continued on. The square felt like a place that had known many evenings like this one. Paul turned off the main avenue and drove through a residential neighbourhood. The houses were close together, their yards trimmed neatly. Sprinklers turned in slow circles, clicking softly. The sound of a radio drifted out from one open window, carrying the play-by-play of a baseball game. Somewhere, a screen door closed with a familiar spring sound. He drove past a small grocery store on a corner lot. The lights were still on inside, and a man pushed a broom along the floor near the entrance. The shelves were stocked with canned goods and bread. A sign near the door advertised milk and eggs. The store looked ready to close for the night, but it still welcomed anyone who might come in for a last-minute purchase. At the far edge of town, the highway crossed a set of railroad tracks. The crossing lights were dark, and the rails shone faintly in the streetlight. Beyond the tracks, the road opened into farmland again. The sky was darker now, and the first stars had appeared. The horizon still held a faint glow, but it was fading. Paul adjusted the radio dial slightly, and the station came in clearer. The announcer spoke about the weather, mentioning fair skies and mild temperatures. He then introduced another song, this one slower, with a steady rhythm that matched the hum of the engine. The road ran straight for several miles, bordered by fields and low fences. Barns stood back from the road, their doors closed, their shapes dark against the sky. A farmhouse light glowed in the distance, a single yellow point in the wide darkness. The smell of hay drifted in as Paul passed a field where bales lay in neat rows. A cluster of mailboxes appeared at the end of a narrow lane. They were lined up like a small neighbourhood of their own, each one painted a different colour or marked with a name. Paul passed them without slowing, but he noticed the way they stood patiently, waiting for morning. Another town came into view, smaller than the last. It had a single main street and a handful of buildings. A sign announced its name in faded letters. Paul slowed as he entered, letting the car coast past a gas station with 2 pumps and a small office. The station sign was lit by a single bulb, and a man inside read a magazine behind the counter. There was a general store with a wide front and a porch that ran along its length. The porch held a couple of benches. The store window displayed jars of candy, bags of flour, and a row of canned peaches. The door was closed, but a light burned inside, casting a warm glow on the wooden floor. Farther down, a small cafe stood with its lights on. A neon sign in the window spelled out, "Coffee." Inside, a couple of people sat at a table. their heads bent toward each other in quiet conversation. A waitress wiped down the counter. The smell of coffee drifted out when the door opened briefly and then closed again. Paul did not stop. He drove through town at a steady pace, past a post office with its flag lowered for the night, past a small bank with a stone front, past a storefront that once had been a pharmacy and now held a different kind of shop. The painted letters on the glass were still visible, a reminder of what the place had been. At the edge of town, the road narrowed and the streetlights ended. The darkness deepened and the stars became more numerous. The air was cooler now, and Paul rolled the window up slightly. The engine sound remained steady, a low, comforting presence. He passed a roadside motel with a sign that glowed softly. The sign advertised clean rooms and vacancy. The motel itself was a long, low building with a row of doors facing the parking lot. A few cars were parked outside, their shapes dark. A light burned in the office window. The place looked quiet and ready for the night. The highway curved gently and began to rise toward a low ridge. From the top, Paul could see the lights of another town in the distance, scattered across the land like small stars. The road descended and carried him toward that quiet glow. As he drove, he thought about other trips he had taken along highways like this one in the 1970s. Family vacations in station wagons, stopping at roadside diners, sleeping in motels with simple rooms and thin curtains. Late-night drives with friends, the radio playing softly, the road stretching ahead without any need to hurry. The memories did not arrive all at once. They drifted in and out, like the songs on the radio. The next town had a different feel. It sat along a river, and the highway ran close to the water. The lights of the town reflected on the river's surface, making long, wavering lines. A bridge crossed the river near the center of town, its iron rails catching the streetlights. Paul drove onto the bridge, the sound of the tires changing briefly as they passed over the seams. The river below moved steadily, its dark surface broken by small ripples. On the far side, the road led into a street lined with shops and offices. There was a bookstore with a window display of hardcovers and paperbacks. The light inside was still on, and a woman arranged a stack of books on a table near the window. A sign in the glass announced a reading that would take place later in the week. The bookstore looked like a place where time moved gently. Next door was a music shop that sold records and guitars. The window held a display of album covers and a few instruments. The shop was closed, but the window light was on, and the reflection of the streetlight shimmered across the glass. Paul drove past a small park with a flagpole and a bench. The flag hung still. The bench was empty. The grass was trimmed and the park looked peaceful, as though it were holding the quiet of the evening within it. He continued through the town, past a row of houses with porches and low fences. Porch lights glowed. Curtains were drawn. A television flickered behind one set of curtains, its blue light soft and distant. At the far end of town, Paul turned onto a quieter road that led away from the river. The road was narrower and trees lined both sides. Their branches met overhead, forming a kind of tunnel. The headlights cast moving patterns on the trunks as the car moved through. When he emerged from the trees, the land opened again. The sky was fully dark now and the stars were bright. The moon hung low, casting a pale light on the fields. Fireflies flickered near the ground, their lights coming and going in a gentle rhythm. Paul slowed slightly, not because he needed to, but because the moment seemed to ask for it. The car moved quietly along the road. The radio played another familiar song, its melody steady and unhurried. He passed a small drive-in theatre set back from the road. The screen was visible above the fence, and the picture flickered faintly. A few cars were parked in rows, facing the screen. The sound did not carry far. The drive-in felt like a private world within the larger night. The road curved again and brought him toward his own town. The familiar sign appeared, announcing its name. The streetlights were on, and the main street was mostly quiet. A few signs still glowed, the drugstore's small sign, the cafe's window light, the gas station's canopy lights. Paul drove past the cafe. The chairs had been turned up on the tables, and a worker wiped down the floor near the door. The cafe's sign remained lit, a quiet promise for morning. He passed the movie theatre, its marquee dark now. The sidewalk was empty. He turned down the street that led to his neighborhood. The houses were quiet, their windows dark or softly lit. Porch lights glowed. A few moths fluttered near them. The trees along the street made a canopy overhead, and the leaves moved faintly in the breeze. Paul turned into his driveway and let the car roll to a stop on the gravel. The stones crunched softly. He sat for a moment with the engine still running, listening to the steady idle. The radio played quietly, the announcer's voice low and calm. He turned the engine off. The night closed in gently. The porch light cast a small pool of brightness near the steps. The rest of the yard was shadow and soft shapes. Paul stepped out and closed the car door with a quiet click. He stood for a moment, letting the air settle around him. Inside the house, the lights were low. He hung his jacket on the back of a chair and set his keys on the small table by the door. The kitchen held the faint scent of supper. He poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. Outside, the highway lay still, waiting for morning traffic and the next evening drive. The towns along it would turn on their lights one by one as the day ended, and the road would connect them in the calm, patient way it always had, holding the quiet memories of the 1970s in its long, steady lines. The winter roads in the country had their own way of speaking. They did not say much, and they did not need to. They showed it instead, in the pale shoulders of snow along the ditches, in the darker tracks where tyres had pressed down slush and then the cold had tightened it again, and in the way the fields lay open and quiet, resting under a thin crust that caught the last daylight like a sheet spread smooth. On a late afternoon in the 1970s, when the day had already begun to dim and the sun sat low and tired, a car moved along one of those roads at a steady, unhurried speed. It was a modest sedan, the kind that carried groceries and school books and mail-order packages without complaint. Its paint had dulled slightly over the years, not from neglect but from honest use. The heater fan made a soft, constant sound, and the defroster kept the windshield clear, leaving a faint warmth along the glass that could be felt if a hand came close. Inside, the dashboard lights were not yet needed, but the radio was on. It was tuned to an AM station that came in clean enough out here, and the announcer's voice had the calm, familiar tone of someone who had said the same sort of things for years. He mentioned the temperature, a reminder that it would drop after dark, and then a song began, not too lively, not too slow, something that simply kept pace with the road. The driver was a man named Harold, though the name did not matter much. He held the wheel with an easy grip and kept his eyes on the pale line where the road met the snow. He was not in a hurry, and there was nothing chasing him. He had finished what needed to be finished for the day. A few small chores had been done around the house. The walk had been cleared earlier and the porch steps had been salted. Supper had been simple. The dishes had been washed and left to dry. The evening ahead had room in it, and the road offered a quiet way to spend some of that room. He drove past a line of bare trees that stood along a fence, their branches thin and dark against the sky. In the summer, those trees would be full and green, and in the fall they would have held leaves that rustled and turned. Now they were honest and plain, showing their shape. A few birds sat high up, small lumps of life, watching the land settle into the colder part of the day. The fields were open, and the snow lay in long sweeps, broken only by the darker stubble of corn left behind after harvest. Here and there a hay bale sat wrapped and waiting. The wind had smoothed the snow around it into gentle drifts. In the distance, a barn roof held a clean white layer, and a thin line of smoke rose from a farmhouse chimney. The smoke went straight up at first, then leaned slightly as a light breeze found it. The road curved gently, following the land, and Harold passed a narrow lane that led to a cluster of mailboxes. Each mailbox had its own shape and its own bit of wear. Some were painted, some were plain metal with a bit of rust at the bottom seam. They stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for tomorrow's delivery. In winter, they always looked a little more patient, as if they understood that things moved a little slower when the cold came. A small creek ran under the road a few miles farther on. The bridge was low, with simple rails. Harold crossed it without noticing much at first, but then the trees opened and he caught a glimpse of the water below. The creek was not frozen solid. It moved under a thin edge of ice, dark and steady, making a soft, continuous sound that could be heard if the window were lowered. The sound was the kind that did not ask for attention, but gave it anyway. The road rose slightly after the creak, and the car's engine changed its tone in a mild way, as if clearing its throat. The heater continued to hum. The radio continued to play. Harold kept driving, letting the miles come and go with the same quiet steadiness as the winter sky. Ahead, a small town sat where two country roads crossed. It was not the kind of town that made the news or drew visitors, but it had everything it needed. There was a post office, a feed store, a small market, and a handful of houses gathered close enough that the streetlights had a reason to be there. Harold saw the first sign before he saw the buildings. It was a simple sign, worn a little, with the town name painted in block letters. As he came in, the road narrowed, and the speed limit dropped. The snowbanks along the sidewalk had been pushed into neat ridges by a plough, and the cleared pavement made a dark path between white walls. A few cars were parked along the curb, their roofs dusted with snow. The streetlights were on, making a soft amber glow that looked warmer against the cold. Harold passed the small market first. Its front windows were steamed slightly, and inside he could see rows of shelves and a counter near the back. A clerk moved slowly behind the counter, not rushing, perhaps straightening a display of canned goods or writing down a number in a ledger. The market was the kind of place where a person could buy bread, coffee, and a few fresh apples without needing anything fancy. Next to the market was a hardware store. The door had a little bell that would ring if someone went in. The window display held snow shovels, a few pairs of gloves, and an assortment of small tools that looked useful even in winter. A coil of rope hung near the door, and a sign advertised rock salt. The store looked solid, like it had seen many winters and would see many more. Across the street was the post office, its flag down for the night, the windows dark. The building was plain, but it had that quiet dignity that public places carried. The mailboxes inside would be filled with envelopes and circulars, and tomorrow morning someone would turn the key and open the door, and the day would begin again. Harold drove through the town without stopping, letting the slow main street slide past. He saw a church set back from the road, its steeple dark against the sky, and he saw a small school building with a yard that was empty now, the swings stiff and still in the cold. A basketball hoop stood over a cleared patch of pavement, and the backboard looked pale in the streetlight. The town felt calm and finished for the day. At the far end, the houses thinned out and the road returned to open country. Harold's headlights were on now, not because it was fully dark, but because winter evenings asked for lights early. The beams spread out over the pavement and caught the edges of snowbanks. The car's tires made a soft, steady sound on the packed surface. The country road ahead was familiar. Harold had driven it in all seasons. In spring it would be lined with wet ditches and the smell of earth returning. In summer it would be bright and dusty, with hayfields and windows down. In autumn it would carry the scent of burning leaves and the sight of pumpkins on porches. In winter it was simpler, more pared down, and in a way, more peaceful. He passed a farm where a yard light shone over a driveway, casting a circle of brightness that made the snow look almost blue at the edges. A tractor sat near the barn, its shape dark and solid. The barn doors were closed, and the place looked settled. Farther back, a farmhouse window glowed yellow, and the curtains were drawn. The glow was small, but it carried far in winter. The road bent and brought Harold past a stand of pines. The pines held snow on their branches in heavy layers, and the dark needles beneath made the snow look brighter. The scent of pine came faintly through the vents, not strong, just enough to remind him what kind of trees they were. The pines made the road feel narrower for a moment, like a hallway, and then the trees opened again, and the fields returned. A few miles later, he came to a crossroads where a service station sat, alone, except for a small diner that shared the lot. The station's sign was lit, and a single pump island stood beneath a canopy that sheltered it from snow. The diner's windows glowed warmly. Harold did not need gas, but the sight of the lights made him slow, and he turned in without much thought, as if the evening had gently suggested it. He parked near the edge where the plough had cleared a space. The tires crunched over packed snow. When he opened the car door, the cold air came in with a quick firmness, and the difference between inside warmth and outside winter was immediate. He closed the door softly and walked toward the diner, his boots making a dull sound on the cleared path. Inside, the diner was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. The air had that comfortable scent of a place that had been open all day. A few people sat in booths. Their coats hung on hooks by the door. The counter held a row of stools, and a man in a cap sat there with his hands around a mug, looking down as if listening to the radio mounted near the ceiling. A waitress moved behind the counter with steady motions, wiping down a spot that did not really need wiping, simply keeping the place as it should be. She looked up when Harold came in and gave him a small nod, not bright or dramatic, just the acknowledgement of someone recognizing a familiar face or a familiar kind of customer. Harold slid into a booth near the window. The glass was cool, and a thin line of frost edged the corners. Outside, the station's light reflected on the snow, making the lot look pale. Inside, the booth seat had that slight squeak of vinyl that belonged to diners and kitchens of the time. Harold set his hands on the table and let the warmth of the room settle him. He ordered coffee and a slice of pie, the kind of order that did not need explaining. The waitress poured coffee from a pot that had clearly been refilled recently. The mug was plain white, thick and sturdy. The coffee was hot and simple. It tasted like the kind of coffee that had been made 1,000 times in 1,000 diners, always meant to be steady and dependable. The pie was apple, served on a small plate, and it smelled of cinnamon and baked fruit. Harold ate it slowly. He did not rush. The diner's sounds were quiet. A spoon stirred in a mug. A napkin holder clinked softly when someone reached for a napkin. The radio near the ceiling played a song at low volume, the same station Harold had been listening to in the car, or one very much like it. After a while, Harold paid at the counter. The waitress thanked him in a plain, friendly way. He put his coat back on and stepped outside into the cold again. The cold felt sharper after the warmth, but it was not unpleasant. It was simply winter being winter. He walked back to the car, started the engine, and waited a moment for the heater to catch up. The windshield fogged slightly at first, then cleared as the defroster did its job. He pulled back onto the road and continued, the diner's warm light shrinking behind him until it was just another small glow among many in the winter night. The next stretch of road ran between low hills. The snow here had drifted more, and the plough had left higher banks at the edges. Harold drove steadily, keeping to the cleanest part of the lane. The headlights showed the pale surface and the darker patches where the snow had been pressed down. The car's tyres held their course without complaint. In the distance, another town's lights appeared, scattered and modest. This town was built around a small square, and in winter it always looked a little like a picture on a holiday card, though it did not try to be. It simply had its old buildings and its steady routines, and winter dressed it in snow and light. Harold came in on a street lined with older houses. Some had small front porches, some had steps that had been shoveled clean. A few had wreaths on the doors, though the season was past its busiest time. The wreaths looked slightly faded, but still cheerful in their quiet way. A few windows held small lamps, and their light made the curtains glow. He reached the square and slowed. The courthouse, a brick building with a simple clock, sat at the centre. The clock face was lit, and the hands could be seen clearly. The time was not late, but it was the kind of time when most errands were done and the evening had begun to settle. A few cars were parked along the square. Their engines were off. They looked like they belonged there, not like visitors. A small drugstore sat on one corner. Its sign was lit, and through the window Harold could see shelves and a counter where someone stood, perhaps closing out the register or straightening a display of toiletries. Next to it was a barber shop with its striped pole. The pole turned slowly, even though the chairs inside looked empty. The light made the pole look warmer than it really was. Across from the courthouse was a 5 and dime, the kind of store that sold small household things and simple gifts. Its windows were decorated modestly. A few items sat in the display, and a sign advertised wool socks and mittens. The store was closed now, but the window light was still on, making the display feel welcoming. Harold circled the square once, not because he had to, but because it felt natural to let the town be seen. He noticed a small park nearby, where a low hill had been turned into a sledding slope earlier in the day. Now it was empty. The tracks of sled runners were visible in the snow, and they made thin lines that caught the streetlight. A bench sat near the path, covered lightly with snow, waiting for tomorrow. He drove past a library, its windows dark. The building was quiet and solid, and the sign out front was dusted with snow. The library looked like a place where warmth waited inside, not from a heater, but from the simple presence of books and the steady way they held a person's attention. Leaving the square, Harold took a road that ran out toward the edge of town, where houses gave way to open land again. The town's lights fell behind him. The road grew darker. The radio continued with soft music and calm announcements. The heater kept the car comfortable. The night outside held its own quiet. The country roads in winter always brought small scenes that did not ask to be remembered, but often were. A farmhouse with a single lit window, as if someone had left a lamp on while reading. A barn where the snow on the roof looked smooth and heavy. A line of trees along a creek, their branches dark and their shadows long. A mailbox with a red flag down, a small mark of daily life standing against the snow. Harold passed a small covered bridge, not large, just wide enough for one car at a time. The bridge had weathered boards and a simple roof. Snow rested along its edges. Harold slowed as he entered, and the sound changed, the tires rolling over wood instead of pavement. The bridge smelled faintly of old timber. For a few seconds, the world narrowed to the wooden walls and the rectangle of light at the far end. Then he came out the other side and the road opened again. A little farther on, he came upon a farm stand that in summer would sell sweet corn and tomatoes. Now it was closed tight for winter, the shutters down, the sign turned away from the road. Snow piled around its base. It looked as if it had gone to sleep until spring. The sight of it was comforting in its way, a reminder that seasons had their own work and their own rest. The road continued, and the land shifted slightly. The fields became smaller here, broken by patches of woods. The snow under the trees looked darker, and the air felt colder, as if the woods held the chill. Harold kept his speed steady. The car moved smoothly through the night. He passed another small cluster of buildings that might not even count as a town, just a crossroads with a church and a store. The church stood back from the road, its steps cleared, its windows dark. The store had a single light on inside. Harold could see shelves through the window and a counter near the back. The store's sign advertised bread and tobacco. A stack of firewood sat near the side wall, covered with a tarp weighed down by snow. Harold did not stop. He simply drove on, letting the crossroads pass, letting the road continue to lead him through the winter landscape. The sky was fully dark now. The stars were visible, not all of them, but enough to give the sense of depth overhead. The moon was not bright, but it offered a pale light that made the snow in the fields glow faintly. In places where the road ran straight, Harold could see far ahead, the headlights reaching out, the pavement a dark strip between white shoulders. He thought, in a calm and ordinary way, about winter drives he had taken in years like this, when highways and country roads carried families to visit relatives, to attend school events, to bring home groceries, to pick up a prescription, to go out for a simple evening meal. In the 1970s, the roads were full of familiar cars with bench seats and radios that clicked between stations. People drove with coffee in thermoses and blankets folded in the back seat. They drove because it was what you did. The road was part of the week, part of the season. Harold's own drive had no particular purpose beyond being on the road. He was not chasing a memory, and he was not avoiding anything. He was simply moving through places that had their own quiet life, noticing what winter did to them. He came to another small town, this one built along a gentle bend in the road. The first thing he saw was a row of streetlights and the glow of a sign for a bowling alley. The sign was simple and bright enough to be seen, and a few cars were parked outside. The building itself was low and long. Harold could imagine the sound inside, the roll of bowling balls, the muted cheers, the steady clatter of pins. He did not stop. He simply passed, letting the sign and the parked cars remain as part of the town's evening. A little farther in, he passed a small skating pond in a park. The pond was frozen, and the ice looked pale under the lights. No one was on it now. The park was quiet. A small warming house sat nearby, its windows dark. The scene looked still and peaceful, as if the day's activity had been put away neatly. He drove past a row of houses with steps cleared and porches lit. In one window a Christmas tree still stood, its lights glowing softly, perhaps left up a little longer because it made the room feel warm. In another window a lamp sat beside a chair, and the chair's back was visible behind the curtain. Everything looked settled, as if each house had its own quiet story going on inside, none of it urgent. At the far end of town, Harold passed a small grain elevator near the tracks. The elevator was tall and pale, and it stood like a landmark against the dark sky. The railroad tracks beside it were quiet now. The crossing lights were dark. The rails shone faintly in the streetlight. The whole area felt like it was waiting for the next day's work. He continued on, leaving the town behind. The road returned to open country, and the quiet deepened again. The heater fan continued its soft sound. The radio played another song. The announcer's voice returned now and then, steady and familiar. Harold drove for a while longer, and the road began to feel more like a loop than a line. The landmarks became familiar again, not because he had turned around sharply, but because the country roads connected in gentle ways, and before long a person could find himself nearing the places he had started from without much effort. He passed the same creek again, though from a different angle. He crossed a different bridge, this one made of concrete with snow piled along the sides. He saw the same kind of mailboxes, the same kind of fences, the same kind of farmhouse lights that looked warm against the cold. Eventually, he saw the first sign of his own town's edge, a familiar intersection and a familiar line of trees. The streetlights here were fewer, the buildings modest. The market's window was dark now. The hardware store's light was off. The post office stood quiet. A single streetlight cast a circle of amber light on the snow. Harold drove through without slowing much. He turned onto the road that led to his own street. The houses were quiet, their windows dark or softly lit. Porch lights glowed. The snowbanks along the driveways were neat, where people had shoveled. The air outside looked cold and clean. He turned into his driveway, the tires crunching softly over the packed snow. He sat for a moment with the engine running, listening to its steady idle. The radio played low, as if it did not want to disturb the quiet. The heater blew warm air that smelled faintly of dust warmed on metal, the way car heaters always did in winter. After a moment, Harold turned the key and the engine stopped. The sudden quiet felt gentle, not empty. He opened the door and the cold air came in again, firm and honest. He stepped out and closed the door softly. The porch light made a small pool of brightness on the steps. The rest of the yard was shadow and smooth snow. He walked up to the porch, his boots making dull sounds on the cleared path. He opened the door and stepped inside. The house held that familiar winter warmth, the faint scent of supper and clean dishwater. A lamp in the living room made a soft light, and the rest of the rooms were quiet. Harold hung his coat, set his keys down, and moved through the house with slow, steady motions, turning off a light here, checking a latch there, the small routines that closed out the day. Outside, the country roads lay quiet under the winter sky, connecting towns and farms and crossroads in their patient way, holding the steady life of the season without needing to say a word.